From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Former Congressman Matt Gaetz withdraws his nomination as President Trump's Attorney General after the House Ethics Committee deadlocks on Wednesday on releasing its report into his alleged misconduct. Plus, Democrats used the lame duck session to push a regulation on credit card swipe fees while confirming two more Biden judicial nominees amid more absences by GOP senators. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial board member Monet Ukwe-Barua. Here's the Truth Social post hot off the press this afternoon. I greatly appreciate the recent efforts of Matt Gaetz in seeking approval to be Attorney General, says Donald Trump. He was doing very well, but at the same time did not want to be a distraction for the administration, for which he has much respect. Matt has a wonderful future, and I look forward to watching all of the great things he will do. Kim, I can only imagine that that noise you're hearing is all of the sighs of relief from Republican senators who are now freed from having to figure out how they're supposed to vote on this nomination or even proceed with confirmation hearings on Matt Gaetz. What do you make of his dropping out of this AG post and any lessons that it might hold for the Trump transition?
That's a really good point, Kyle, about the fact that there's sighs of relief among Republicans. And I think it says a lot about why Matt Gaetz's nomination was in trouble from the beginning and why this was the only route in the end. We have, all of us in Washington, seen many, many instances of Democrats lodging allegations and claims against Republicans. And I think Matt Gaetz sought to suggest that this is what was happening to him. And he certainly had sold that to Donald Trump, that look at all the lawsuits that have been brought against you. Look at the Steele dossier. This is just the same. In fact, just earlier today, Matt Gaetz made reference to these allegations against him and suggested that it was his own Steele dossier. But if you stepped back, the problem was a couple of things. I mean, one, you did have a Department of Justice investigation into many people will write that off because they don't have a lot of trust in the DOJ. But he was being investigated as well by the House Ethics Committee, which is a bipartisan group made up of Republicans and Democrats, and a committee that I would note is historically very wary of casting stones because of the whole glass houses issue. It does not like to set precedents that could come back to bite the members who sit on that committee or their friends or whatever. So they're very careful when they do these investigations. They don't go out on limbs. And yet it looks as though there's a pretty gnarly report sitting in that ethics committee that has become the fight. And we always knew this was going to happen. Some of the stuff from the Department of Justice investigation, which made its way to the ethics committee, was already getting leaked to the press. Some of it raises some very, very hard questions. And the reality is, too, it's notable. This goes back to the point about the senators and House members, Republicans. You know, normally when you get these allegations against a Republican and they are fantastical, there is a rush of support and a desire to say these are partisan claims. You didn't have that among Republicans because many of these guys have been in situations with Matt Gaetz. They know him fairly well. Congress is a pretty clubby place, and a lot of them had some concerns about his temperament and history. We don't know for certain exactly what's in that report. We might never see it now, but the bottom line is that it was clearly concerning enough that Matt Gaetz felt that more was to come and that he did not have a way to get over the finish line.
What I'd add is it seems to me that it became unsustainable for Gaetz and Trump to think that these allegations could be bottled up in this private report by the House Ethics Committee. The committee did meet for about 2 hours on Wednesday afternoon where they discussed whether to release the report. Here's the top Democrat on the Ethics Committee, Susan Wild, after that meeting.
We had agreed that we were not going to discuss what had transpired at the meeting, but it has come to my attention that the chairman has since betrayed the process by disclosing our deliberations within moments after walking out of the committee. And he has implied that there was an agreement of the committee not to disclose the report. That is an untrue, to the extent that that suggests that the committee was in agreement or that we had a consensus on that, that is inaccurate.
According to her, the committee agreed to reconvene to discuss this question again in 2 weeks. There was also a movement by Democrats to force some kind of floor vote on releasing this report through a privileged resolution, and notable that at least one Republican telling the media that he would vote for that. He would vote in favor of releasing this report. Here is Republican Congressman Derek Van Orden on CNN.
Would you vote to release that report?
I think it's very important that everybody has as much knowledge as possible so that they can make an informed decision.
It sounds like yes.
That's a yes. So if the rumors are true about Mr. Gaetz' conduct, then there should be referrals to other agencies. And if they're not true, then there's a whole lot of people that owe him an apology.
Meantime, the details that might be in this report were getting out in the media anyway. A lawyer for two women who were accusers of Matt Gaetz speaking to many TV outlets, including ABC News. So, Monet, to me, this looks like a recognition by President Trump that this nomination was going to have real problems. It might get stuck in the Senate, might get voted down by the Senate, and an effort to cut his political losses and move on before it got to the point that it became more than a distraction, as Gaetz and Trump are now saying.
Yeah, I think that the House Ethics Committee was in a very difficult position regarding the report on Matt Gaetz, because on the one hand, you have the historic precedent and rules which confine them not to release that report once he had resigned Congress, because generally you wouldn't comment on a person who no longer is part of that chamber. But also the fact that he left Congress to seek this higher office meant that the allegations against him actually had become more important rather than less as a consequence of his current position. And so I think that the right move for them should have been to release that report because of the unique circumstance of him being nominated to the Attorney General position. The U.S. Senate needed to be able to consider those allegations, not just in a piecemeal fashion, but ideally with the imprimatur of the House Ethics Committee, as you mentioned, a bipartisan group of legislators doing an investigation over a long period of time with quite a lot of process involved. That would have been the best way for the Senate if Matt Gaetz had continued to seek the Attorney General position to make their decision about those details. But I do think that even if they didn't do it, those details would have come to light in some fashion. And that's exactly what you were starting to hear from some of the senators. They were going to get that information. The lawyer representing two of those accusers of Matt Gaetz is already starting to speak to the press. And there's no doubt that he would have been brought up before the Senate to comment on those allegations, and probably several other witnesses would have too. And so I think that President Trump realized that regardless of what the House Ethics Committee did, this information was going to come to light in some fashion. Senators who had talked to Matt Gaetz over the past week had most likely indicated that their vote was going to depend on what the details of that investigation contained, and they realized that there was no way for them to get over the threshold they needed for him to be confirmed.
Hang tight, we'll be right back. Welcome back. Kim, I would second that point. Heartening to see these senators taking seriously their advise and consent role of confirming nominees. I'd cite two. The South Dakota Senator Mike Rounds, here is what he said. If there's an ethics report out there that is being or that has been completed, then I think the Senate is going to want to see it. It may very well speed up the vetting process. On the other hand, if it's not available and we have to recreate it ourselves, that would delay our ability to make a decision on a very critical nominee. Texas Senator John Cornyn suggesting something similar, saying that if the Ethics Committee is not released, the Senate could simply call those same witnesses to testify. Here's the John Cornyn quote: "In order to do our job, we need to get access to all the information, but also to protect the president against any surprises that might damage his administration." And I find that pretty heartening. There had been some talk in recent days about whether the Senate was going to confirm anyone that President Trump named, maybe go into recess and let him make recess appointments, bypassing the advisory advise and consent role. But I think that John Cornyn is exactly right there. The Attorney General's job is enormously important. And while the president can nominate whoever has his trust, the role of the Senate is to make sure that the AG's office is filled by somebody that deserves the nation's trust and somebody who is not going to create problems for the administration and for the United States.
This is always the tension in Washington in both parties, which is the tension between party versus duty. And all of the pressure here that had been coming from the transition team and the president was, you have an obligation to vote yes on this person, confirm them because he's my pick. And, it would be damaging to Republicans if you don't do that, be damaging to me. That overlooks a couple of things. One, the thing that you just mentioned, which is that senators have a duty under the Constitution to advise and consent. And that means to look deeply at the candidates and make sure that they are suitable for the positions. But the other thing it overlooks is don't underestimate just how frustrated many Republicans are. Legitimately, this is not just a talking point for them. They are very deeply concerned about the Department of Justice, its politicization under the Biden administration, and prior to that, under the Obama administration, overzealous prosecutors who have dragged us into uncharted territory, for instance, with lawsuits against a former president of the United States, overzealous prosecutors going after companies, et cetera, trying to engage in partisan crusades rather than looking fairly at the law, and the reputation of the Department of Justice, which is badly in need of a corrective and actions that will slowly build back some trust among more than half of the country that no longer believes that it is doing its job as it's meant to be doing it. So they care very much about getting someone that's at the top there that has the credibility and the history and the experience and the temperament to both accomplish that reform, but also to regain some trust in the institution among the public. And it's very, very hard, I think, for many of them to have wrapped their heads around how Matt Gaetz was that person. And for the record, there are a lot of people out there that you can choose that are very reform-minded and by the way, are not going to mess around and yet have a certain command, a certain level of respect, which you need at the top of that department. And again, a certain amount of professionalism that is supposed to help regain trust among the public.